With rising political tensions post the COVID pandemic, the West and the rest of the world in general has been looking at alternatives to China as a manufacturing hub and overall looking more towards diversifying the global supply chain. And all of a sudden, concepts like nearshoring have started gaining in prominence. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a look at some of the candidates who are emerging as alternate manufacturing hubs to replace China. For decades, the world chose to ignore its exposure to a single manufacturing location. And it was only after the political tensions that arose post the COVID-19 pandemic that the rest of the world woke up to its exposure. And as the world started looking for alternates to China as the single manufacturing location, the pendulum swung several thousand miles west to a location very close to the United States. I'm talking about Mexico. And along with Mexico came the term nearshoring, meaning you're not really back on shore, but almost in the neighborhood. And it is Mexico's location that makes it an ideal hub for regional distribution. It is almost centrally located between North and South America, so the transport of goods throughout North and South America becomes very quick and efficient when Mexico is the distribution center. Only 4% of goods in China contain US-made components, but 40% of those in Mexico contain US-made components. And this is what creates a big element of synergy with respect to the regional aspect of trade. And from an infrastructure perspective, Mexico has a very well-developed supplier network and extensive transportation network, as well as logistics infrastructure. The biggest advantage for Mexico, though, is with respect to lead times, meaning transportation from China traditionally takes at least a month. And if you were to transport products from China to the US West Coast, that means the ships have to pass through the Suez Canal as well as the Panama Canal. But with Mexico, you can completely get over the issue of canal and port congestion because you can carry all the goods by land, reducing the lead time from more than a month to just a few days. The UN estimates that approximately $27 billion of lost trade from the US-China tensions will be captured by Mexico. And this is expected to be the largest amount by any single country. And a lot of the shift is already in motion. Food, basic metals, mining, pharmaceutical, and automotive sectors are projected to have heavy investment in Mexico. Actually, automotive giant Ford has already invested about $260 million in its new global technology and business center in Mexico, while Volkswagen is reportedly investing $763 million in its electric vehicle plant. And the growth speaks for itself. In 2016, the US imports from Mexico stood at $293.5 billion. In contrast, in 2021, they totaled $384.6 billion, a 31% increase, and 36.7% of this constituted machinery and mechanical appliances. So when did this shift actually start? The timing was approximately around the pandemic, and China's zero COVID response led to shipping costs hitting record highs, and buyers found their goods stuck in container backlogs with air freight virtually non-existent. And with the limited options available, nearshoring became the most attractive option. The most interesting aspect of this whole shift is that even Chinese firms are increasingly looking at Mexico in an effort to access North American markets. And one of the catalysts to this shift was President Donald Trump threatening to levy additional tariffs on goods from China. So Chinese investment increased from $154 million in 2016, before Donald Trump became president, to $271 million a year later, once he had threatened to impose additional tariffs. And by 2021, Chinese investments in Mexico had reached an astonishing $492.5 million. Actually, one of the big factors making Mexico a very attractive place for investment is the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. Enforced since January of 1994, the NAFTA eliminated most tariffs on products traded between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And that is primarily the reason China too has started investing in Mexico. The Mexican economy too is a little complicated in the sense that NAFTA has driven growth of foreign investment and high-tech manufacturing in the industrial north, while the agrarian south is still a little detached from the new developments. But with all these factors in favor of Mexico, there have to be certain factors that favored China to quite an extent. Well, for starters, it's the population and the size of the labor force. China has a population of 1.4 billion compared to 130 million for Mexico, and a labor force size of 793 million compared to 57 million for Mexico. Now, this is strictly 2021 statistics. While the labor force makes a difference, the key factor also is the total population, not because of the labor force, but the fact that China itself is a huge market that all the other developed countries want to have access to. So the countries moving out of China to Mexico need to realize that they would also be losing access to China as a consumer market. And that is primarily the reason companies like Tesla are investing in China to cater to the local market because of its sheer size. So are companies really looking to move away from China? The answer is a little tricky. North American companies seem more interested in Mexico because it is a nearshoring model and gives easy access to the supply chain and flow of goods. Europe, though, may be relatively a little more neutral in that aspect, but it is actively looking to diversify its portfolio and its supply chain, and this concept is being termed as China+1. So essentially looking for other nearshore initiatives in the ASEAN region itself, and countries that are coming up as potential candidates are Vietnam and Indonesia. So while China may continue to be an attractive option from a infrastructure and consumer market size perspective, a lot of companies will start looking for cheaper options, and depending upon their location, may choose Mexico or other countries in the ASEAN region. And talking of the ASEAN region, one country that stands out in that region as an alternative to China is Vietnam. And the prominent drivers seem to be its shipping infrastructure, competitive labor, and production costs. Compared to China, Vietnam's biggest advantage is its low labor cost, which currently stands at around $2.99 per hour compared to $6.50 per hour for China. And with a good amount of investment from the government itself, Vietnam has a relatively large and well-educated labor force. The government on its own has put in a lot of investment towards vocational education in areas of tech gaps within Vietnam. Though Vietnam has a lot of advantages as an alternative to China, it still does not compare based on the sheer size of China's manufacturing base. Though many big multinational corporations like Adidas, Nike, Apple, and Samsung have moved a lot of their manufacturing to Vietnam, the shift has not been really what you would call seismic. But if we look at the entire region as a whole, then there may be a potential competition to China. I'm talking about ASEAN as a whole. ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeastern Nations, comprises countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, among others. So together, these countries could provide the competition that could induce many countries to use this group of nations for diversifying their supply chain. And just as it is important to have access to the big Chinese consumer market, when it comes to ASEAN, the countries like the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Indonesia together have a new emerging middle class and a new set of consumers. And this group is driving demand for telecoms, financial services, automotive industry, and other consumer goods. When you look at the overall growth within this region, the primary sector still is the financial sector. But manufacturing is quickly catching up, with Vietnam leading the way. If you were to view ASEAN as a whole, then it would be the third most populous state in the world after India and China. And what sets this region apart from China and Japan is that ASEAN is young and growing. It has a median age of 30, and if you compare with China's 39, Japan 49, and 38 in the US, ASEAN definitely has an advantage with respect to the age demographic. And as I mentioned earlier, the fast rising middle class is boosting consumption, making it a very attractive market. And the region has unique strengths within each of its countries that make it an attractive, diversifying investment. In the sense, Vietnam is increasingly looking like a mini China when it comes to electronics manufacturing, whereas Malaysia is churning out desktop computers for global markets. Thailand is shaping up to be a regional hub for automobile manufacturing, as many of the Japanese and Chinese car makers have moved production to Thailand. And Indonesia has been able to do well with respect to developing nickel mining and related battery production for electric vehicles. And with this boom in manufacturing, exports have jumped to a record 22.6% growth last year, the highest in the overall Asian region. So what are the key challenges that ASEAN faces? For starters, there's a liquidity gap, meaning investors are not so upbeat yet with ASEAN to pump in enough investments for the future. The other challenge which makes China still attractive is that the ASEAN is a group of countries, each of which have their own legal systems, market infrastructure, as well as bureaucratic hurdles that you need to navigate to get your manufacturing business going. But as investments come in, the various markets will react and adjust to accommodate the growth. So we've talked about the Americas as well as Asia as alternate spots for a manufacturing hub. What about Africa? There should be a good low-cost area that could become a competitor to China. The interesting thing in Africa is that countries which have a strong tech manpower are not really competitive when it comes to the cost. Countries like Kenya and South Africa are not able to compete with China when it comes to cost savings related to the tech workforce. And when we look around, the second most populous country in Africa stands out as a potential competitor. I'm talking about Ethiopia. With a population of 100 million and a cheap labor force, Ethiopia has already started attracting the textiles industry, partly because it is a direct competitor to Bangladesh when it comes to infrastructure and labor costs. With a fairly stable political climate, Ethiopia has started looking into the future, and subsequently, more than a dozen odd industrial parks have started springing across Ethiopia. But when you look at the biggest industrial park, the Hawassa Industrial Park, some interesting facts start emerging. It was built by a Chinese contractor. It hosts 18 companies from 11 countries, but it is solely for textile and apparel. And at capacity, it has the potential to employ 60,000 workers. Ethiopia aims to grow its GDP by 11% annually for the coming 10 years, and the manufacturing sector is targeted to grow by about 25% every year. There's another variable in the mix which makes Ethiopia a country to watch out in the future. Ethiopia is a central hub for China's Belt and Road Initiative, which means the Chinese government itself is interested in building the economic infrastructure in Ethiopia. And as a result, Beijing has become Ethiopia's top trading partner. And as I indicated in episode 59, China's debt diplomacy may come in the way of a sustainable growth for Ethiopia if it continues to be dependent upon China for its infrastructure. So looking at all the candidates we have reviewed, does any one country stand out as being the next big manufacturing hub? Mexico potentially, but still has a long way to go. Vietnam is next, but on its own may not be able to rise up to compete with China. Not to mention, the big attraction of China is its market itself. So it cannot be suddenly ignored by the big companies themselves. So we are potentially looking at a more spread out global manufacturing, easing the risk from China to some extent. But in the longer term, as the cost of manufacturing keeps increasing in China, the world will diversify and find alternate centers for manufacturing. But how far away is that going to be? Only time will tell. And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. As a tribute to the greatest civil engineering achievements of the 20th century, the American Society of Civil Engineers has chosen the 7 wonders of the modern world. 2 of the wonders in the list were covered in the previous episode. Which were those 2? Netherlands' Delta Works system and the tunnel through the English Channel are considered among the 7 wonders of the modern world by the American Society of Civil Engineers. So the answer is B, the Channel Tunnel and the Netherlands' Delta Works system. Question for the current episode. Which are the top 3 manufacturing countries in the world currently? Are these A, China, South Korea, and Japan? B, China, India, and Japan? C, China, Germany, and Mexico? Or D, China, the United States, and Japan? Once again, which are the top 3 manufacturing countries in the world currently? A. China, South Korea, and Japan. B. China, India, and Japan. C. China, Germany, and Mexico. Or D. China, the United States, and Japan. The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. In the next episode, we go down in history and look at some of the biggest instances of hyperinflation in various countries. What triggered the hyperinflation and how it was brought under control. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.